Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel, with your host Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Hello everyone. Hello Mike.
Hello Rick.
Today is our session number 85. So isn't that how old Caleb was when he said, "Give me this mountain"?
Well, I'm not sure, but some days I feel 85.
And we don't feel as young and strong as Caleb did at 85.
In no way.
He said, "Give me the mountain where the giants live. Give me the hardest place in the whole country."
Yes.
At 85 years old.
Wow.
I want that partly because that was the land inheritance of Judah, but partly because he had a long memory. He was thinking back 38 plus some years after they'd already crossed Jordan. But he's thinking about when he and Joshua and the other 10 spies went in at Kadesh, and Caleb's the one who came back and said, "We are well able to take that land. We just need to trust the Lord. He's given us the land, so let's go in and take it." But the 10 spies brought back an evil report, and the people chose to believe those 10. So Caleb's thinking, and the reason, the excuse they gave for not being able to go in is the giants lived there. So here, 38 plus years later, Caleb at 85 says, "Remember that excuse your fathers gave for not coming in because the giants lived here? Well, I'm 85 years old, and I want the mountain where the giants live to prove to you that that was a poor excuse."
Yes.
And he drove out those giants. There's some interesting passages that talk about where those giants went to. I don't know if you've ever looked into that, but it's interesting. The giants, many of the giants, or what was left of the giants, settled in one of the places it names as Gaza. And Gaza is really an interesting study in the Bible. It's so timely today with what's going on with Israel. But by the way, today is November the 15th, 2023. This is Truth Be Told, Mike Maney and Rick Howard. But if you're up to session 85, you know all of that. And you know what kind of weather both of us should have around the middle of November. And you know what our politics are. So we'll just jump right over all that.
You're welcome, Braden.
But if you simply do a word study on the word Gaza in the Old Testament, you'll find way back in Genesis, it was the land of the Canaanites, a doomed people. And then when God brought Israel out of Egypt, he said, "I'm not going to take them that way along the seacoast, through Gaza, by the way, even though that was shorter, because the people will not be up to maybe the hardship and the war that they're going to face that way." And an interesting thing about that is they faced war the other way they went too. But there's something about Gaza. And then later, when Caleb drove out the giants, they settled in Gaza. It's kind of a cursed land. And some of the prophets, like Amos 1:6-8, is one of the later prophecies about God's judgment against Gaza. In fact, maybe I'll just turn over and read that passage because it's so interesting, the wording. And I'm not sure if what's happening over there right now with Israel. I look at this one channel that simply is a camera that's pointing across at Gaza. And there's no narrator, no person or anything. It's just a camera, and it has the volume on. And you can see all of the flashes of the bombs. You can hear the bombs exploding. You can hear the tanks. You can hear the jets overhead. You can hear the rounds of the various types of guns that they're using to clear out Gaza City. It's interesting just to look at that. And then you read a passage like Amos chapter 1, verse 6. "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they took captive the whole captivity to deliver them up to Edom. But I will send a fire upon the wall of Gaza, which shall devour its palaces. And it says that at the end of verse 8, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, says the Lord God. Well, we know a lot about prophecy has multiple smaller fulfillments before a final fulfillment.
Yeah.
So, what's going over there right now might be a precursor to a final fulfillment of this prophecy, or what's going on may be part of this prophecy. Because there sure is a lot of, as it says in verse 7, I will send a fire upon the wall of Gaza. There's a whole lot of fire going on right now,
Yes.
above ground and below ground.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
So, it's just interesting that way back, God not wanting to take Israel through that land of Gaza, he took them the long way. Of course, he had other reasons for taking them the long way, like he wanted to get them to Sinai, other things like that. But that particular land seems to, the giants kind of represent evil demonic forces on some level, those giants of the Old Testament, those Nephilim and Anakim and all those kind of groups. And the fact that one of their final strongholds was Gaza, to me is interesting how it's being played out today. Such evil they just committed. What they did on October the 7th,
Yes,
I would say was beyond human. It was demonic. And the fact that it came from Gaza in connection with these Bible prophecies is so interesting, because then we connect Gaza and the other city-states of the Philistines, that Gaza Strip area, to another giant who came out of there later, Goliath, who is an antichrist figure, and David, who is a Christ figure. And it looked like that Goliath was going to have an easy win. Some people have said in this current thing going on that Hamas's plans, they've uncovered some of their plans by going into Gaza, that their plans might have been to push all the way across Israel to the West Bank to connect with the Palestinians over there, to whether it ended up being a final victory or land seizing of Israel's land, probably not permanent, but what a major victory it would have been for them to be able to say, we made it all the way across Israel to our brethren on the West Bank. And they had enough weapons and men willing to try it and all that may have been part of their goal. But it's so interesting to me that, back to Goliath and David, Goliath and David is basically a Genesis 3:15 outworking.
Yes, it is.
And so, here we have today David, Israel, fighting against Goliath's, at least territory, probably genetically, they're not the same people, because the Philistines were more seafaring from like Greece and across the Mediterranean, and settled and built up the land of the Philistines. What I didn't realize, I know I'm kind of just wandering all over the place, but I did a little study of the history of the Philistines, and in the Bible, we tend to get this picture of them as being like prehistoric, backwards, bullies, uncivilized, but they were quite the opposite, according to historians and archaeologists. They were advanced peoples who came across the Mediterranean and built, for their day, very advanced cities. Those 5 city-states of the Philistines supposedly were very advanced for their time. So that's why, being such a small area, kind of like Gaza today, it kind of surprises us that they were able to do such large damage against Israel. That the Philistines, from such a small piece of land, were able to, at times, conquer Israel and harass them for hundreds of years. And it just seems impossible, but they were able to do it. partly because they were pretty advanced for their time. So it was an interesting research that I did. But today we have at least the land area. Of course, the Palestinians in Gaza today are Arabs. They're not Europeans or Southern Europeans. So they're not genetically the same, but land area and prophetically and in principle, that they have that kind of connection. You know, Palestine is supposedly a more modernized version of the word Philistines that the Roman Emperor gave to that land just as a mockery against the Jews. Be that as it may, there's a lot of debate about that. But it's just so interesting to me that that piece of land that once housed the Philistines, who were such a constant enemy, thorn in the flesh to Israel for so long, that same piece of land in the 21st century is still being a major problem to Israel. Just you look at the map of the whole world, you look at the population of the whole world, you think, Israel itself, when you look at a big flat map, Israel itself is just a small speck surrounded by huge Muslim countries. But as small as Israel is, Gaza is even a smaller speck. And yet you think the attention of the entire world is on a speck inside of a speck of land. And yet it has captured the attention of the whole world. It's pitting the major powers of the world against each other. Turkey, who is a member of NATO and one of the most powerful Middle Eastern countries as far as economy and military and so forth, part of NATO, and in recent years has developed a pretty good working relationship with Israel because of how much benefit Israel's able to provide, you know, technology-wise and agriculture and just so many areas. Israel's so advanced that some of the more, would we say, neutral or not extreme Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and so forth, even Jordan was for a long time, doing business with Israel because Israel had so much to offer them. And Turkey was doing that. But now, just in recent days, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has come out strongly against Israel and in favor of the Palestinians. I know some of those guys have to do it publicly for PR reasons in the Muslim world. That's part of it. But he really does seem to have made a sharp turn against Israel. And so that's, you know, you see things lining up, don't you? See,
yes,
as I've said several times recently, you have you have three main Islamic countries competing for dominance, wanting to be the country that ushers in the final Islamic Caliphate. Those three countries are Turkey, and they want it because they had the last Islamic Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire. And so they want to revive that, and they feel like they have the top spot or the biggest reason to revive it and to usher in the final caliphate. But then you have Iran, and they're Shia Muslim, and they're Persian. And so, and then you have Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia feels like they deserve it because that's where Muhammad came from. That's where Mecca is. So that's the heart of Islam, is in Saudi Arabia. And they're extremely wealthy and influential. And then Iran. So Iran is Shia Muslim. Saudi Arabia is Sunni. So there's a competition there for who is the true Islamic religion. And then Iran is Persian. Saudi Arabia is Arab, and Persians and Arabs have a long history of doing battle with each other. So kind of a long time hatred there. And then Turkey being Turks. So you have different ethnicities, different forms of the Islamic religion different reasons for feeling like they should be the leader of the new caliphate.
Mhm.
And so they're all trying to position themselves for that. So that's a lot of why Turkey, I think, is taking this sharp turn against Israel, is because that final caliphate, part of it coming about is the destruction of Israel. So if you want to be the Islamic nation that brings about the final caliphate, you have to be against Israel. So there's a religious component, there's an ethnic component, there's a political component, there's a financial component involved in all of this. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in the Muslim world that's causing people to scratch their heads of why are they acting like they are? Well, there's a lot behind the scenes that maybe we don't quite understand. So how does this tie into what we're trying to do in the book of Numbers as we're trying to lead up to the story of Balaam and Balak, is that Israel had come to Kadesh-Barnea after 2 years, and the 12 spies went in, and we know that story. We went through that previous sessions. But one thing Mike and I have been trying to work out just prior to coming on our recording, and we're asking for your help out there in cyber world. Maybe you've done more research than we have. We always knew this, but it's kind of become fresh again to us. The story of the 12 spies in Numbers 14 and 15, and then by the time we only get to Numbers chapter 20, it says, then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. The people stayed in Kadesh. So is this 38 years or close to 38 years later than the story in chapter 14 and 15? It appears that it is. So if it is, and one reason we know that it is because it goes on to say that Miriam died there. And then starting down at verse 22, Aaron died soon after. And they didn't die just 2 years out of Egypt. They died toward the end of the 40 years. And how do we know that, Mike? Where's that passage later in the book of Numbers you told me about before we came on?
That was
33.
Was it 33:23? I don't remember now. Let's see.
38, 20, 33, 28. Then Aaron the priest went up to Mount Hor at the command of the Lord, and he died there in the 40th year. So at the end of the 40 years is when he died, after the children of Israel had come out of Egypt on the first day of the 5th month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died at Mount Hor. Now he was 83 when Moses came back down to deliver them from Pharaoh. So this is 40 years later that Aaron died, and yet it's described back in Numbers chapter 20, right after when they were at Kadesh a second time, and Miriam died there at Kadesh, and then they left Kadesh to go through Edom, and that's when Aaron died at Mount Hor, which, as best we can tell, is down there in the land area of Edom. So I guess one of my points would be is that it's interesting that from their first time at Kadesh until their second time at Kadesh in Numbers 20, and you look at the chapters in between, not a whole lot happened. We have the story of that we went through last time, of the rebellion of Korah in that group. And, we have a few other things like the budding of Aaron's rod, because there was always a struggle about who should be the priest. And then it has some of the various laws. And then we come to chapter 20. And so you think very little was recorded about those 38 years, the time between the two times at Kadesh. Very little is recorded. So then you ask the question, how come so much is recorded about the first 2 years, but so little about the next 38 years? And I think one clue that we get is later in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, the first couple of chapters, really provides a great benefit to us in understanding some of these timelines, because Moses goes back and recounts the 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we're given some information we're not given, like in the book of Numbers, like in Deuteronomy 1 and 19. Then we came to Kadesh-Barnea, and that's the first time, because it goes on to describe the spies. And then we go into chapter 2, and it talks about their further journeys. And let me see, I had it earlier. Now I'm not able to, like in verse 14. And the time we took to come from Kadesh-Barnea until we crossed over the valley of Zered was 38 years. Until, and I think this is why we're not given much about those 38 years. Until the generation of the men of war was consumed from the midst of the camp, just as the Lord had sworn to them. So that generation had to die off, and there wasn't a whole lot to talk about. He does say back in verse 7 of chapter 2, the Lord our God has blessed you in all the work of your hand. He knows your, I think the old King James says goings. The New King James says trudgings. I like trudgings. That's kind of what that 38 years was.
What verse was that?
Deuteronomy 2 and 7.
And 7.
Does it say goings?
Thy walking.
Walking.
Yeah.
Okay. The New King James says trudgings.
Trudgings, yeah.
And that's kind of what it was. So then we go over to, we start looking in other places where it recounts the events of the wilderness journey. And we pick up a lot of good information, like in Psalm 105 and 106. And in 106, Psalm 106 talks about when they came out of Egypt. And it says in verse 9, and I don't want to make too much out of this, but there is something there. You need maybe do a little bit more word study, look at more verses and things. But it does seem that God makes a distinction between, like in verse 9, he led them through the depths and through the wilderness. God led them. And we know that the pillar was fire, cloud was with them the whole way. But it does seem that the first 2 years, until they went to Kadesh with the 12 spies, was clearly God's direction for good.
Mm-hmm.
The next 38 years was God's direction for punishment, for judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that 38 years is described is not as much, even though, again, the pillar cloud of fire was with them. But it says in 106:9, he led them through the wilderness. But in 107 verse 4, they wandered in the wilderness in a desolate way. They found no city to dwell in. So there's several verses that seems to describe that last 38 years as a wandering, something less than an actual journey or leadership of God. Again, that last 38, God was still leading them, but he let them kind of just wander around on their own to a degree, just kind of waiting for that generation to pass.
I picture them just kind of traveling a circuit for 38 years, because they did remain in that general area before traveling north, where we get into our story of Balak. But so they kind of just went in circles. It's how I picture it, because they had their livestock So they probably had to follow the patterns of grassy fields and watering holes. And so that's probably what he was doing, just going around, as the seasons changed, they were nomadic. And so there would be watering holes that they knew were there, grassy areas to feed their sheep that they knew were there. So they just kept traveling around in this circuit. That's how I picture it.
Yeah, let's go pick up a couple more clues, because the thing we're trying to establish, that maybe some of you listening to this can fill in some of the gaps, is what was going on during that 38 years? What events? Is there much in the story of letting us know? And these two times at Kadesh, 38 years apart. So it says in Numbers 14, remember when God said, God killed the other 10 spies, and he told them anyone 20 years old and older would die in the wilderness. And so they said, okay, we'll go in. And Moses said it's too late. But they went ahead and tried to make a military effort into Canaan, and they got pushed back. And it says in verse 45 of Numbers 14, then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that mountain came down and attacked them and drove them back as far as Hormah. So there's a driving back by the people of the land of Canaan against them when they made that attempt. And then we go over to Deuteronomy chapter 1. I know we're jumping all over the place, but these are all given as clues.
Mm-hmm.
Deuteronomy 1:28. It says, so you remained in Kadesh many days. This is their first time there, according to the days that you spent there. Then it says in 2:1, then we turned. So they turned away from the land of Canaan and journeyed into the wilderness of the way of the Red Sea. So they're kind of retracing their steps. They're going backwards. They're retreating. What other negative words can we use? Because they were going backwards spiritually. Now they're going backwards literally, physically. That kind of represents what the condition of their hearts and their spiritual condition was. So they journeyed into the wilderness of the way of the Red Sea as the Lord spoke to me, and they skirted Mount Seir for many days. So they're down in the land of Edom, in the land of Esau. So it's just another interesting, you make a spiritual application or whatever, is that these 38 years were spent wandering in the land of Esau. And the description of God about Esau, he's going to be kind of a wild man. He's going to be living off the land. He's going to be a fighter. He's going to be just rough in many ways. And it kind of describes the condition of Israel. And so that 38 years, they're living more like Esau than they are like Jacob. So I've never really thought about it quite that way before, that there's a reason why God, in their rebellion and rejection of Joshua and Caleb's report, refusing to go into the land at that time, there's a reason why God wanted them, for their wanderings of 38 years, to be in the land of Esau. So some of you may want to develop that listen to this, because this is kind of a little bit of a fresh thought to me. I always knew it was the land of Esau, but there's something deeper there. God purposely wanting them to be experiencing more of the life of Esau than the life of Jacob.
So one way or another, Brother Rick, we're going to get our viewers.
We're putting little pieces together.
Yes. Well, we want them to send in their research. So we're going to get it from you one way or the other.
So you're getting a view of Mike and I a little bit on the fly, because we brought up a few of these questions before we came on, and we looked up a few verses, jotted down a few notes, hoping that we could kind of work it out on air. And you that are watching this or listening to it are probably saying, yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like you're trying to work it out as you go.
Well, then send in your information, please.
Let us know how long ago and easily you worked all this out. And we may ask you to come on air and explain it to our audience. But for some reason, I kind of knew this, and what you do through the years, you kind of notice things in the Bible, but that's not what you're studying for at the time for a sermon or a lesson.
Right.
So it's kind of like gets tucked in the back of your mind for, I'll look into it later or something, and you don't quite get there. And so now we come to a place where Numbers chapter 20 and verse 1, they're in Kadesh. Well, is this Kadesh 2 years out of Egypt, or is this Kadesh 40 years out of Egypt? Well, it's at the end of the journey, not at the start of the journey. And we're just not really told a whole lot in between, other than God letting them wander around till that generation died off.
Yeah. And then the few clues were given, the death of Aaron. And so we're given some clues, but we may never have all the pieces in place.
And, maybe another thing to bring up is it's hard to know exactly how he felt, but how Moses, the end of Moses' life was pretty sad, wasn't it? So in this same chapter, we have three big events. Miriam dies, and she's the one who rescued him as a baby. So, his protector, older sister, dies in the wilderness at the end of their 40 years or close to it. And so no doubt that was a real deep, sharp pain for Moses. And at the end of this chapter, Aaron dies. And so he loses his sister and brother, the two closest people to him. He had already lost his wife. He had to send her back to her father. We're told so little about that afterwards. So you wonder how lonely he was at this point. All these old, long-time close companions, family are gone. And then that may have helped contribute into why he struck that rock a second time, is in this chapter 2. And then God tells him, you're not going to get to go in. You're not going to get to lead the people in. You're going to die outside of the land. So I would say Numbers chapter 20 may be Moses' saddest chapter. This is a sad chapter. I never quite thought about it that way either. Terrible loss of family, loss of, I've led these people for 40 years, put up with everything, tried to be an intercessor over and over when God was going to destroy them. I know I'm 120, but we know at the end of his life, he said, my eyesight and my physical strength is as strong as it ever was. So it wasn't like he was just hobbling around, barely able to make it.
Right.
So he was physically well able to take them in. And God tells him, you can't. You did all the hard work. Of course, Joshua was there all along. So he had, it wasn't an easy life for Joshua either, but Joshua gets to be the one, to be the great commander, conquer the land. And then his brother and sister die. And this is kind of at the end of his life. So, we hold Moses in such high esteem, rightfully so. But it's kind of a sad, lonely picture at the end of his life. So I don't know if I've never really just meditated on that. That the three events of this chapter is kind of descriptive of the emotional state of Moses at the end of the journey.
The next time we see him is on the Mount of Transfiguration.
Yeah, he was in pretty good shape there, wasn't he?
Yeah. Looking dapper and young, and yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. Let's go over and look at that for a minute. I hadn't had this prepared, so
it really is on the fly today.
It really is on the fly. Let me see. So Matthew 17. But let me see. Is it, maybe it's Mark's version. No, it must be Luke's version. Go find it real quick. I'm looking for something very specific about the Mount of Transfiguration.
Mark 9:5 would be Mark's rendering of it.
No, Luke. I kind of knew it was Luke all along, but
you want Luke 9:33 or in that area?
Luke 9. No, I'm looking at Luke 9:31.
Okay.
Because Luke's the only one that brings this up. It ties in with their whole theme of looking for Christ in the Old Testament. Look at what it says, verse 30. Behold, two men talked with him, who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory. And what was their discussion topic?
And they spoke of his decease, which he should accomplish at Jerusalem.
How could Moses and Elijah speak of the decease of Jesus? Partly through the writings of Moses and other prophets in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if they quoted scripture to each other from the Old Testament scriptures. I wonder if they discussed Isaiah 53. I wonder if they discussed Psalm 22. I wonder if they discussed those verses that talk about him as the suffering servant, the Lamb of God. The wording is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not it doesn't seem to describe that Jesus is bringing up new information to them. It's as if all three had an understanding what was about to take place, and they were discussing it. Can you imagine Moses and Elijah? I mean, I've tried to preach on it, and I've heard many good lessons and sermons and devotionals on the Mount of Transfiguration. But I've never really heard many people dwell on this part of what they were discussing and why that subject and how they knew enough to discuss it. So they spoke of his decease. Well, they would be Moses and Elijah. Now, no doubt Jesus also spoke, because he was the one that was going to be killed. But it's as if they already had good knowledge of what was about to take place, and they were discussing it with him. What a discussion that would be to listen.
It wouldn't be any different than the two men on the road to Emmaus, but he took them right to the scriptures, like you're saying, and then he showed them from the scriptures. The other thing that stands out in my mind was the very fact that they were speaking. We're talking about two dead men.
Of course, they're talking to a glorified Jesus, so it's kind of a spirit symbol almost of. But Peter and the others were able to see them.
Yes.
So they appeared, but just to be able to hear that discussion.
Yes.
What they would have said. And I mean, one thing they might have said is the only reason we can be here in such a condition, such a wonderful condition, is because of what you're about to do.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a pretty good understanding of the eternal benefit to them as two people
Mm-hmm.
because of what Jesus was about to do on the cross,
Mm-hmm.
and then his resurrection, of course. So they had a lot of insight into that subject, and it's almost as if Moses and Elijah were talking to Jesus about it more than Jesus was talking to them about it. So I wonder if a lot of it was just thank you and praise, and
Mm-hmm.
and this moment that we prophesied about and that all the men of old wrote about is just about ready to take place.
Not only that, but this was a witness to Jesus' disciples. And so I'm thinking of that verse where it says, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. They're declaring Jesus was going to die at Jerusalem. So this was a testimony to his disciples as well.
Yes. Yeah. So anyway, that's
bonus. This is bonus material, viewers. This is all bonus material.
Yeah, our goal was to talk about Balak and Balaam, but we knew there was just some little bits of information leading up to it that was important to deal with. And maybe we'll just close, because the whole subject of Balak and Balaam. So this session will be a little bit shorter than normal, which you're probably all standing up and cheering. But Balak and Balaam is its own big story, because we need to talk about Moab and the Moabites and who they were and where they came from and what their future is. And there's a lot in the Bible about them. So that's like a whole separate topic. But maybe we could close in chapter 21, that famous story of the bronze serpent, verses 4 through 9, that Jesus picked up on to Nicodemus in John 3. So that was this would be a story that every Jewish child would be told many times. A very, very, very familiar story. So that a man like Nicodemus, as the leading rabbi of his day, who claimed to know more about the Old Testament than maybe anybody alive at his time, this would be an old story that he had heard his whole life, that he had taught to his disciples for many years. He probably thought he knew every single thing about that story. But Jesus is looking at him saying, you remember that story about Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness? That's a type and a picture of me. The Son of Man must be lifted up so that all who look on him can be saved. And
yes,
you can almost see Nicodemus's eyes growing bigger and bigger, like, I have never brought out that aspect of that story before, not one time.
And that's the problem.
That's the problem.
You and the whole nation. Yeah.
You miss the importance of that story. It's not just historical,
right?
It's prophetic.
Yes.
Prophetic. But I just, like to imagine on my own mind Nicodemus, the leading rabbi of his day, being told new truth about a very familiar story that he had never even thought of before.
Brother Rick, when you think about it, back to the road to Emmaus, they had the facts in front of them, but they needed someone to come along and sew everything together. And so from the scriptures, Philip did that to the eunuch. He put everything in its place. Stephen did that in Acts chapter 7, chasing down all those successive covenants. And then speaking of Jesus as the one Moses foretold, that prophet. So he found it necessary. And that's what we're trying to do here, really, with this ministry of Truth Be Told, is just kind of string these scriptures together in a semblance where you can put them together and understand them in their flow. So that these men were doing the same thing.
Yeah, I think people have their daily Bible readings, have these plans where they read through the Bible in a year and everything. And you kind of get the feeling you hear people talk about it throughout the years, and you just kind of get this feeling that they start with Genesis with excited feelings, and they're trying to understand everything, read every word, and think about it, and get refreshed with all the details of each person and their stories and everything. By the time they get to Numbers chapter 20, their interest is fading. They're skimming a little bit quicker.
Their eyes are rolling around in their head.
But you know what little we brought up today from Numbers 20 and now in 21 is a lot of good stuff, isn't it? It's a lot. It's good. It ties itself in with the major themes of the Bible. It is part and parcel of the whole story.
Yes, it is.
It deserves to be there. It deserves to be dealt with. It says in 21:4, they journeyed from Mount Hor, because that's where Aaron died, by the way of the Red Sea. So they're circling around, going backwards, sideways, and wandering is the term the Bible uses it, to go around the land of Edom. And the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. I've used that as a text before. A lot of our Christian journey seems to be wandering around, going in circles. We're trying to do the right things, but it doesn't seem like we're getting anywhere. And so our soul gets discouraged. And we read, usually when we're preaching on a subject like this, we'll make sure we read Paul's words about be not weary in well-doing, for you shall reap if you faint not. Other good verses like that, verses of encouragement to the congregation, because we know, because we're part of the congregation. We're a sheep as well as a shepherd,
Yes.
And our soul gets very discouraged on the way. We preach our hearts out week after week. We study, we pray, we care for the people, and we don't always do the best job of it, but we try to do a respectable job of it. Try to be somewhat faithful in our calling. And we sometimes don't see many results. Sometimes the real results seem to go backwards. That generation seems to be dying off.
Yes.
Rather than growing and advancing.
Yes.
So we get discouraged. And verse 5, at the end of verse 5, they spoke against Moses, and they said, our soul loathes, detests this worthless bread. This is manna from heaven. This is angels' food.
Yes.
This is what God supplied them. They said, we detest this worthless food. I've had people say this about me, and I've heard say it about their own other pastors and things. And in some cases, I know which pastors they were talking about, and I know it wasn't true. I know that the problem was not in the quality of food being given. It was in not appreciate the food being given.
Yes.
Because I've heard variations of people when they leave a church, they'll say something like, I wasn't being fed. Well, were you not being fed because the food was not good, or were you not being fed because you refused the food? Now, any decent pastor is trying to fulfill his calling, is trying to provide good food.
Yes.
From the Word of God. And sometimes, I've tried to encourage younger pastors who kind of allow themselves to feel guilty when people kind of say that about them, that, man, I'm doing a lousy job. Well, okay, try to do better. But at the same time, sometimes we need to recognize, like the Hebrew writer did, I'm telling you things that you ought to be able to understand, but you're hard of hearing, you're sluggish of hearing. So the problem is you, not me.
Yes.
So, it's not always the case, and a pastor should always try to do a better job of presenting sermons and providing good food, but it's not always the fault of the giver of the food. It's often the result of the people being tired of the food being given. And that's kind of what's happening. God gave this food.
Yes.
And yet they detested it. They called it worthless. Well, it was the opposite of worthless. As I've said before, I think it probably provided every vitamin and nutrient and amino acid and mineral, and it was probably the perfect food for good health.
Yes, tasted like honey,
nourishment, everything. I think it was the most complete food man has ever eaten in a single item, and yet they called it worthless and they detested it. So, God took it personal, didn't he?
You think about the manna reflecting Christ, the man from heaven. And so he was that perfect God man. So he was fully self-contained, full of the word of grace, of truth. So he was the physical embodiment of that manna.
So you swerved into something important, didn't you, Mike? So basically, what was the problem with Israel at Christ's first coming? They rejected God's bread from heaven.
Yeah.
They called it worthless.
Yeah.
And so God, in essence, sent fiery serpents among Israel at and after the death of Christ. And those who looked on him within Israel remained branches left on the olive tree. They were the wheat. And those who did not were cut off from the olive tree and were chaff, burned up. So this story, in essence, was repeated in the ministry of Christ to the same bloodline people, just in a later version of it.
Brother Rick, kind of off topic, but maybe somewhat parallel. I came across this idea of that in the Old Testament, a woman who was married wore a veil, as opposed to someone, who wasn't married. And I got to thinking, when God, when Jesus died, the veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom. It's almost as if he's unveiling her, because now she's not his bride. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I'd looked at it kind of the opposite, that the, more positive light, that the way into God was now open, and don't have to go through a human, go directly to God. That veil is broken. But I think you might be onto something, that veil was also symbolic of God being among them, that veil being broken. I mean, in essence, when he said in Matthew 23, your house is left unto you desolate, that is kind of a divorce of his people. And that's why, under their law, you can only be remarried if your husband dies. That's why Romans 7 talks about their husband died. So now they can be married to him again. Beautiful. That Romans 7 is beautiful.
Very beautiful. Yes.
That's what allows Israel to be married to him again. And so I think you're onto something, that veil being rent could also be representative of, because, this swerves into another thing. There's kind of a general principle. There's kind of like the speaking of tongues on the day of Pentecost. It was both a blessing, and that those Jews from the other nations who could only mainly understand the language of where they were born, not the Hebrew language, could be blessed by hearing the gospel. But Isaiah talks about that with other tongues, as if it's a judgment against Israel, that what you should have done, being a witness to the nations, I'm going to use the tongues of those nations to get the job done. So the gift of tongues was both a blessing and a curse. And the renting of the veil was kind of both a blessing. The way to God was open for the rest of the world, but the marriage veil was torn in two between him and Israel. I never thought about it quite that way.
I hadn't either.
But I think I think that fits, and I think that someone listening to this may develop it further and let us know. Probably not let us know. They may end up using it in a sermon or lesson one day, but I think there's really something there. I think you need to develop that a little bit further.
Yeah. So here again, viewers, listeners, we're challenging you to dive in and help us out here in some of these areas.
And it gives the younger men hope that two old guys that they think our brains aren't working very well are still able to develop some decent thoughts on the spot, on the fly,
Yes.
working off each other.
Yes.
So you have hope that you're not going to be a mush brain when you get our age.
Yeah. However, unlike Caleb, when I'm 85, I'll be, instead of give me a mountain, I'll say, give me the remote and a couch and a bag of Doritos
And a bowl of pudding.
and a bowl of pudding.
But for right now, we're still going.
Yeah.
Well, what else do we want to bring up before? Okay, chapter 22 gets into Balak and Balaam, so we won't go there today. But they're just about through their journey. They're working their way up to the east side of the Jordan so that Moses can die and Joshua can take him across. So the book of Deuteronomy is going to get us through all that, but Numbers brings us up to that point. And then Deuteronomy kind of goes back and recounts the whole time, and then gets us to the death of Moses and the song of Moses, and all that's going to be great. So we'll be in Deuteronomy for several sessions, but Numbers is actually, I think it was 4 or 5 sessions ago, we thought we would be finished with Numbers before now.
Yes.
As you go through these chapters that are often overlooked, or people think there's only just a few little things and then move on. Every one of these chapters are pretty rich.
Yes, they are. Yeah. Especially, as we said, when you string them together and you're just building this whole storyboard, you're not just seeing the Bible in bits and pieces, you're seeing a flow.
That's tied to
crucial.
A larger story, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's important for people to understand. Well, I've enjoyed this session, brother. Not bad for some ramblings, huh?
A little bit of a unexpected surprise, huh? We knew we wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork for Balaam and Balak, but it ended up being a little bit more fertile ground than what we thought it might be. So that's always a good thing.
Yes. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why, like on Wednesday nights, we meet in our dining hall and sit around the big rectangle set of tables. So we're all kind of facing each other. And we're just going through the scriptures, having open discussion. I may lead out, but there's some Wednesday nights I try to say as little as possible, because the benefit of listening to other people in your congregation. If there's only one voice going out of the pastor, and you do this very well at Missoula, you include all the men in the service. The pastor needs to be fed as well. And I hear some wonderful things from the lips of men and women on Wednesday nights. They bring up some really good thoughts.
You always want to gauge, what do they know? And so when you stop and listen, you find out. You might get things started, but then when it catches fire and there's conversation among several, you're finding out how much they've retained and what they know. That's important too. And
it's good for them because it brings them out.
Yeah.
Maybe of their shell or something. But anyway, as we showed today, one of the best ways to think is to speak. And you may not always come across real well because you're maybe haven't organized your thoughts as well as you'd like to. But thinking while you're talking is a good thing. And hopefully we showed some of that today. Anyway, I guess that's enough of our session recorded. So maybe stop the recording and then we can talk a little bit afterwards maybe. But
all right. Well, thank you, Rick. And thank you, viewers. We hope that you were enriched by some of these our daily ramblings or weekly ramblings anyway. Lord bless you.
Thanks, Mike.